Family abolition is about the proliferation of relationships of care, not a kind of destruction of the relationships we already have. It's feminists who have mounted an analysis of the private nuclear household as the site of the overwhelming majority of the rape and abuse that takes place on Earth.
All women are disgusting. There's lots of them. I don't know how many of them. I've had enough of women. I don't want to have anything to do with women. Why? Well, that doesn't require much explanation. Your girlfriend is like your mother. I'm often accused of being gay. Well, yes, obviously, meow, let's go kill some snakes. Hitler did this beautifully. The Nazis were unbelievably great, Nazi-like. Like, what the hell is that? Look at me, I'm Hitler. I've watched 100 movies, but I don't understand up. Okay, up. From where? Why up? It's low resolution. It's low resolution.
Hello.
That was great. I didn't know how you were going to make that intro because it's Plato, so it's like there's no footage of Plato or like so. That was a good. That was
bit of synchronicity. Like you mentioned it as a topic, and then for whatever reason that week, both the clip of old PP and that clip of Sophie Lewis talking, who's like a radical feminist. Both things that just appeared on one of my feeds. So it all came together nicely.
Nice.
So,
was it me who posted the Peterson video? Because I think I posted that as well.
I've seen it many times. It's a pretty good edit. I should probably credit whoever I stole it from. But yeah, it's pretty funny.
It's great. I love it. Why up? Why up?
Peterson, the postmodernist, right? Cool. All right. Owen, what are we talking about today?
Yeah, well, we're going to talk about the section in the Republic by Plato of, on family. Kind of controversial passage, a few passages in, well, it's actually a section. It's like a good few pages in the Republic about family and what to do with the family, the role of women and children. Plato is kind of a family abolitionist or a kind of communitarian styled has an idea. This is really a complicated topic because we have to also talk about who he's talking about. It's not for the whole society. It's specifically for one class of people. So I want to caveat it with that. But yeah, basically, Plato's got a sort of family abolitionist styled idea, pretty kind of utopian, as most people would say, about how we should raise children and how men and women should marry and all that. This is the section which is before the even more controversial section on infanticide. So, so this is like some of the most controversial sections in Plato. I think we just read the family stuff for this episode. We might do an infanticide episode at a later stage because that's also quite a schizo topic. But yeah, this is the controversial section on the family in Plato, and it's pretty schizo and it's pretty interesting, and it doesn't really fit that neatly into modern political parameters of left, right, conservative, progressive as well. So yeah, that's what we're talking about today.
Yeah, it's got some interesting intersections because I think I'm not well read on Plato, to my great shame. So I didn't even know that the next section's on infanticide. So that sounds interesting. But yeah, obviously I read this section, which is book 5, I think. And it was interesting because I heard about this section before from people, and lots of people are saying, well, lots of people have told me that, oh, well, Plato's basically just a communist or whatever. And that's part of the story. He's definitely communitarian, but it doesn't kind of capture the whole story, right? Like, because there's some stuff in here that is very much like it's definitely communitarian, definitely about holding wives and children in common is I think what he says exactly. But he also does say, he also advocates like a form of eugenics as well, right? So some
Yeah.
interesting like crossovers between, if you want to look at it from a political angle, that is. I suppose the Republic's all political, right? You really have to fill in the gaps for me here. I'm not well read on Plato at all.
Yeah, well, exactly. I mean, it's hard to categorize it politically in modern terms because it's very hierarchical for one, in its own weird sense, because it's about a eugenicist breeding program of like the people by which the philosophy rulers are going to be chosen from. So this isn't like the farmers and the merchants. I don't think Plato is particularly concerned with how they run their families. They could probably just do whatever they were doing back in ancient Greece. But it's specifically a kind of eugenicist program for picking the elites, basically the ruling classes, basically. And it's interesting because it does bring up the theme of not having an aristocracy, because it's called the Republic. So we don't have a monarchy. We don't have a blood inheritance, as you do in a monarchy. So there's a kind of fill in, like a kind of, well, how do we have like royal leveled breeding and ruling classes without relying on an aristocratic structure of inheriting power that way? And I think that's kind of what Plato is trying to think through to a certain extent here. There's other dialogues which reinforce this idea, which maybe we can go into at a later stage. But yeah, it's not communitarian in the modern sense, but it is communitarian, and it's also eugenicist. And it is also, just to caveat this, as I was saying earlier, it's also specifically designed for who are called the guardians. So the guardians are a class of people in the Republic who are going to be the rulers, or at least the philosopher kings, and actually, well, at least this is complicated, potentially queens as well, although we're going to get into that. But are chosen from, and they are brought up in a very militaristic styled upbringing. So it's very minimalistic. It's kind of Spartan. I do think Plato is looking at the Spartans here a little bit, and Spartan education, and sort of trying to infuse the physical discipline and military discipline of that with the philosophic styles of Athens. So there's a kind of educational paradigm here, and the guardians are basically brought up as soldiers. Their main duty, primarily at first, is military. But then they're also educated in like mathematics, philosophical discourse, maybe some other subjects, and from them, a certain ruling class is then chosen. If you're not chosen, but you're in the guardian class, you probably wouldn't get to be like a political figure, or maybe not a philosopher, but you would be somewhat philosophically trained, and you would still be a soldier, if that makes sense. So it's specifically this class of people that are being thought about eugenically. It's not like, the merchants and the farmers or whoever else, right?
Yeah. It's interesting because it has, and you have to correct me if I'm wrong on this, but Plato, from what I've read, seems fairly like unconcerned with the majority of people. Like in a sense, he sounds very elitist in the same way that a later Nietzsche might be. Like Nietzsche, he does talk about the mass of people, but he talks about them in a very negative way. And what I've read of Plato, he's very similar, right? Or very uncaring about the majority of people. What he's concerned about is, I guess for Plato, he's concerned about his guardian class. Nietzsche would be concerned about the Übermensch, because they are the drivers of history or society, etc. I suppose the example Nietzsche would give was Napoleon. I'm not sure what example Socrates would give. Maybe I don't know enough about the time period. Maybe some sort of Spartan leader. I don't know, but yeah, that's kind of how it strikes me. It just seemed like an early version of that to me.
Yeah, totally. It's a concern with people who are going to rule primarily. It's not necessarily a concern with everyone else. I personally think that if you are going to educate people who are going to rule, you probably do need to think about everyone else, even if you don't think about them in the same way, like giving them the same education and so on. But anyway, you know, it's true, yeah, that he's not particularly concerned with everyone else. It is a ruling class pedagogy. It's a kind of elite pedagogy, and you see this in a lot of Plato's texts, where Socrates is often speaking to young Athenian men. For example, Alcibiades, the famous Alcibiades, who was the kind of Achilles of Athens, and was actually exiled for very stupid reasons. At a very crucial stage in Athenian history, when they were at war with Syracuse, and I do think there's a kind of implicit critique going on here too of Plato, kind of saying that our best people are not being educated and elevated enough, and that comes out in the dialogue of Alcibiades. Socrates is very concerned with Alcibiades' education, and he does try humble him a little bit, because Alcibiades is a very kind of flamboyant, arrogant sort of Athenian young man who's got plenty of ambitions. He's kind of an Alexandrian figure in some way, and he tries to humble him a little bit, but he also tries to kind of say, you are the kind of people that will lead us one day, and you need to be educated properly, and you need to know the nature of justice and truth and so on if you're going to lead us. So it's a common theme in a lot of Plato's dialogues, which is how do you educate your ruling class, and philosophically how philosophy can sort of relate to that education, because I do think that's something that we've definitely lost in the modern world, in a kind of technocratic world of technical experts and managers. Is like, we don't really think of how our ruling class can relate to philosophy in any way. We just sort of think philosophy is a peculiarity, a hobby, which is kept far away from power. It's kind of impractical or something, right? So, yeah.
I was electrified by certain parts of this, because it is like kind of pathetic of the situation we're in today, especially with this concern over creating a worthwhile elite in a way, because we do have, like you say, we've got this managerial system that is self-replicating and doesn't really replicate much that is particularly noble. Like, we have very unimpressive and sometimes malicious elites, and it's definitely connected. I suppose in a very anachronistic way, I would say this view of the Guardians as primarily military but secondarily intellectually trained is very much harkens to the later idea of kind of the Renaissance man, like the Renaissance man. Okay, maybe later on the elite aren't warriors and stuff, but they're definitely adventurers and athletes, but also well trained in the arts and intellectual matters as well. And that's something we very much lost. Like, we have so much technological and statistical power, but the issue is we're so specialized that people who are making decisions about people's health, for example, are really unhealthy and have no connection to their own bodies, for example. And people who are making proclamations about the environment know nothing about nature, for example. It's completely disconnected from everything, right?
Yeah, it's a good point. It's very much more like a generalist style of education. It's cultivating an authority that can see the whole picture. It's not specialized, like you're going to be educated to work in an industry, and you can specifically be very good at, I don't know, like financial speculation or software engineering, or right. Even like a modern scientist, like you can be very good at understanding like biochemistry or something like this, right? But you're not really educated holistically in a way in which you can sort of make decisions about the entire society and sort of balance different things against each other, and kind of take a kind of like moral responsible role in the whole of the society. So that's one thing. And the other thing, as you were saying, is the embodied thing, that we don't really have an idea of embodiment anymore being something to do with authority. Like we seem to have fallen into this state where it's acceptable to like have a soldier that drone strikes people who sits in an office. It's acceptable to as you were saying, have an environmentalist who doesn't spend any time in nature. It's acceptable to have a health minister who's like grossly overweight, right? So it's like there's a total lack of embodiment here in our modern kind of authority structure as well, which is a good point.
And it's not just saying, oh, I want everyone to be knowledgeable about everything, but it's something that you don't have to go much further than Adam Smith to he talks about how you make a pin, right, or something like this, right? And he's got all these special machines in the factory that do a specific thing, and what that allows you to do, instead of like a handcrafted pin that's made by one guy in a sizable amount of time, you have millions and millions that are made really, really fast, right? So there's great power in that, but there's we're suffering from the negatives of that now. And I've definitely given this example before, but a good example of how far specialization has gone is that are you familiar with the Magic Roundabout in Swindon in England?
Yeah, I think you've brought this up before. Yeah,
I use this example all the time, but it's so ridiculous. Yeah. So this roundabout in Swindon, which is a wonderful town in England, but it's basically like how confusing roundabouts are for people who haven't been on them before. So it's like one of those, but then around the outside there are like 6 other roundabouts. So look it up online. It's crazy to look at. It's not when you get used to it, it's not actually as intimidating as you'd think. But it was designed by a civil engineer who had never driven a car before.
Yeah.
Which is just like, okay, I understand how specialization can be great for manufacturing and making someone really good and efficient at one thing, but it enters some crazy territory when you have people designing roundabouts who don't know how to drive a car.
Yeah, this is really confusing for the Americans listening because they don't have roundabouts, so they
can look it up. They can look up what all the bing bongs are doing on their road.
There's a Simpsons episode where Homer gets stuck in a roundabout when he does a trip to England, I think it is, and anyway,
just goes around and around and around.
He doesn't know what to do. Yeah, but yeah, that's a good point. The other example I often bring up here is Anna Freud, who apparently died a virgin. So that's another kind of expert. And it's funny because I was doing a reading of one of Freud's texts the other day, and he brings up this kind of like rationalization thing about children's education, and he says he kind of brings up the idea of telling kids, for example, that the babies come from the stork and egg, and he's like, are we not confusing them by telling them, that are we not kind of lying to them? And I was kind of thinking, yeah, but if you tell them like the penis goes in the vagina, blah blah blah, is that like, do they think they're going to understand? Anyway, the point is that rationally minded people really sometimes have this disconnect between like the embodied existence in their area of expertise and their sort of rational speculation or rational sort of scientific study about that area. I think there is a disconnect, which is definitely kind of a paradigm of modern intellectual authority, basically. Yeah.
So anyway, back to the text. I got us way off topic there.
Yeah. Well, that's just to jump in for a second. That's so, we could talk about that a bit more, but it's that would be the kind of pedagogy stuff, right? So you have people that are trained physically and intellectually, and the way in which this happens, this could be another episode we could do. Read Defenseology if you want to learn about this. But there's a specific sort of understanding of how the sort of intellectual and the physical in our education and in ourselves relates to each other too. There's a kind of paradigm here of like trying to synthesize things which are seemingly opposite to each other, like physical and mental. And in terms of virtue, this also relates to the attempt in Plato to fuse together like temperance and wisdom with courage. So there's also a theme here of trying to fuse, trying to get soldiers who are like brave and strong, while at the same time trying to kind of civilize them in a certain sense, which also makes them cooperative, appropriately cooperative, and maybe compassionate is not the right word, but appropriately sympathetic. Like one example he uses in, I think it's the Republic as well, in a different section on the Guardians, is he says, like, we want strong soldiers who will fight, but we don't want them to like turn that aggression in on the society itself and like just take over and just like hoard all the wealth for themselves, using their physical and military supremacy to just take all of our stuff, basically. So there's a kind of need to fuse these tendencies, but this isn't just a sociological concern or like a criminal concern. Like, you want soldiers, but you don't want the soldiers to turn against your people. That's kind of obvious. There is a kind of philosophic concern here too, kind of as we were bringing up, of like, do you know, like, do you have real knowledge of something if it's purely mental and not also embodied too? So it's not just the kind of concern of like public safety. It's a properly philosophic concern here when we're trying to fuse together these different aspects of the physical and the mental, or like the courageous and the prudent. There is a kind of understanding here that like through this fusion, like real knowledge will be gained as well, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I think that's one of the most attractive things about a lot of the philosophies of antiquity. At least from my outside perspective, you have to correct me if I'm wrong on this because I'm really not well read on it. But it is in contrast to later philosophies. I mean, even someone like Nietzsche, who takes inspiration from this time, his Übermensch is a very ruthless, a very dominant being, right? And you look at the more spiritual philosophies, Christianity, whatever, right? They go to the other direction that you were talking about. They become very passive and ascetic, and those sorts of things, right? And this is somewhere in the middle, because Socrates is almost Plato is almost seeing that if you have too much of one or too much of the other, you either end up completely impotent, or you end up in the will to power. You end up in you end up back with nature, basically.
Yeah, exactly. And there's there's even a quote in The Statesman, which basically says, and this is probably more relevant for our time in certain ways, but it says, if you have an excessively sort of diplomatic and cooperative ruling class, they will sort of instill a character within the general public of being excessively like unwarlike. And this will seem nice at first, but over time, the society will kind of gradually expose itself to external threats, and it will kind of gradually almost kind of civilize itself into a state of submission. And I do think that is somewhat really akin to our time, because even though we've had, like nuclear weapons, and, NATO certainly isn't afraid of being brutal to its enemies, but this is all quite technological. And I think that what's happening is that like the actual character development of a people is becoming separate from the military power of that nation. So the military power is all technological, which means that we can become very, consumeristic and passive and effeminate. We kind of outsource the role of the soldier to the technology, and then over time sort of instill itself in us. Enslave ourselves is probably a strong term, but become exposed to enemy threats. It's exactly what's happening. Like if you look at Russia and China situation today, it's exactly what you see. You see like the kind of decline of the West, and all these other. Well, it could be Islam, it could be Russia, it could be China, all these other powers emerging. So that kind of technological capacity kind of distorts the character development in a way which eventually makes us, in some weird sense, too cooperative.
Right.
So yeah, anyway, that's another aspect to it. So anyway, the point is that within this educational paradigm, they're trying to achieve a balance between these two kind of opposing and seemingly paradoxical opposites of cooperation and and aggressivity, warlikeness, courage, and so on. And it does seem like a lot of the historical kind of ups and downs, I would say, of civilizations in how they reach heights and drop and fail, does seem to sort of it does seem to be conducive to how that society kind of operates within that paradigm of kind of a dialectic and a tension between cooperation and warlike and unwarlike, courage and wisdom. If you look at the Germans in the early 20th century, they certainly went very much towards the warlike position, and they were in some sense too warlike and too domineering, and I think that led to their downfall, right? Just like the opposite could lead to your downfall. So there's a kind of civilizational survival guide here kind of going on of like, if you want to do well and survive, like stick in the middle, not the middle, but stick in a kind of harmonic state, basically.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because it isn't just today as well. I would argue that with the Roman Empire, you had Roman citizens being very warlike at the start. And then, it wasn't a technological outsourcing of aggression, but it was definitely an outsourcing of aggression to, people they could give citizenship to, and then foreigners, then mercenaries, and all these sorts of things. And the actual Roman population became more effeminate, became more passive over a long period of time. And, exactly the way you were describing what's happening today, pretty much, apart from, it's with technology and not barbarians instead.
Yeah, 100%. I do think you can look at Rome this way. I think you could even look at the emergence of Christianity in this way too. The emergence of Christianity is paradoxical. It comes from Rome. It emerges suddenly out of this warlike super empire of like tough men, and you're like, that's paradoxical. Like, how did that emerge from? Like, you'd think that would emerge somewhere else. No, it emerged in Rome, and that's a paradox. And I think you can get to these paradoxes better by looking at things in this way. Plato really gives us it's not just about like pedagogy in the very practical sense of like the people living here and now, but it gives us a kind of historical paradigm to look at this stuff through. So that's one of the really fascinating things about this.
Right. Yeah. Well, one thing I did want to talk about is, I suppose, lots of, I guess just normative society, and definitely the right, is they have a categorical attachment to what we call the family, right? The family unit. And, there's some good points in that. I'm not disagreeing with that. But what people call a family has definitely shifted over time. That's one thing that, gender studies actually kind of gets correct in its analysis, I would say. And one thing that is interesting here is you almost do have a proto version of the feminist maxim that the private is political. And there is that sort of taking the children of this class, or to be this class, away from their family, away from their mother and away from their father, and putting them into this common system, this caring system in common, but also a rearing and educational system in common that is supposed to raise them in a certain way. And it is interesting how, Plato does kind of see the fact that, well, if you're going to have a father figure, or like a single father figure or a single mother figure, like you can do whatever you want to them in school, and you can do whatever you want to them physically and whatever, but that ultimately is going to have a huge influence on them, whether that's ideologically or just emotionally through what we might call trauma or whatever. I'm not sure if you cottoned onto that, but that's something I took away from this, that's for sure.
Yeah, it's a good point. I forgot we were talking about the family for a minute there. We were talking so much about Rome and stuff.
You've got defensology on the mind, my friend.
Yeah. This is the problem. As soon as you get me going in this area, I just my brain just goes blah. But I think family, obviously, family relates so much to all this other stuff we're talking about, because paternal identification. I think psychoanalysis is a good tool by which to sort of have a look at some of this stuff too, because you have things like paternal identifications and ego ideals and so on, right? So like, like you have a tension between the society and the family in that sense. Like, you might look at your dad, especially when you're a kid, you might want to look at your dad and say, he's this great man and I'm going to imitate him. And then when you get older, you might like be exposed to other sorts of character ideals in society through, whatever, like teachers or celebrities or whoever, right? So there's a kind of tension there as well between like who you mimic and who you model yourself off, right? And I think Plato's concerned here with the kind of character ideals or the ego ideals, as they would put in psychoanalysis, of the family. I think he might think, I'll put it this way. There's a tendency to assume, because of modern collectivism or modern communitarianism, which is very carey, sharey, and kind of, it's very coddly. It's kind of maternalistic in character in a lot of ways. But like, I think it could be in some sense the opposite. Like, Plato thinks that the nuclear family was turning people into pussies or something. Like it's like, because I'll give you an example, and I do see this particularly like with middle class people. Like, I do see, like, this is an angle of critiquing, for example, the university, which we don't often take into account. We, like, your general conservative will say something like the kind of ideological institutions are kind of public sphere, and then you have the private sphere, and that the public sphere is kind of brainwashing kids, and it's treating them too softly, and it's doing all these kind of like whatever quotas. If you need so many women, you need so many this people, that people, and it's not meritocratic, and it's not competitive enough, and blah 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 blah. But it's like, I completely agree with the state of institutions today. That is a accurate observation. But I'm not convinced that the family is the opposite to that. Like, people do tend to favor their own kids, and that's only natural. But at the end of the day, like, in a society, if you want the best people to lead, like, and you have parents getting involved and like sort of making things easier for their kids, so their kid succeeds over other kids, well, then you don't really have a good system of picking the best. Like, and I do think that is an element of, for example, schools and universities that happens today. It doesn't happen directly. Like, you're not going to have a kind of provincial mom going down to Harvard and saying, hey, look, my kid needs special treatment because blah, 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 so give them a higher grade. But you will have other ways of that happening. Like, money is a form of that. And also, like, psychiatry and medicine is a form of that. I remember, like, when I went to Birkbeck, the first year I had exams, like, no one was in the fucking exam hall. And I was like, well, there was a few, but like half the year wasn't there. And I asked someone after, I was like, where was everyone? They were like, oh, just doing their exams at home. Like you just tell the university you've got anxiety and you do your exams at home. And I was like, oh, well, I wonder. So like, you're really comparing my exam results to the person who did their exam results at home? Are you telling me they didn't cheat? Like, come on. Like, it's just like, the whole system of the whole, I would say the whole loss of real meritocracy within the West today. Like, I'm not totally convinced it's totally an issue of like communitarian and public values. Like, there is a critique of the private sphere here too, I think. So I don't know. I'm not really sure if I answered your question there, but it's something to think about.
Interesting points. I mean, just as you were talking about it, I almost came to like the realization that this focus on the nuclear family, I mean, there's a reason why it's called the nuclear family, right? And it's kind of an American invention. But to like think about, I don't know, this is something that didn't occur to me while I was reading this, but it's occurred to me just now, is that, all these things that Plato is talking about, people being taken from their parents at a very early age, if not as soon as they're born, being kept in common, doing physical activities, being classically educated. You're describing English boarding school.
I was going to bring that up. I was going to bring
This
up.
is exactly how our elites, our guardians, were made when we had a massive empire.
Exactly.
So maybe he's got a point, man.
Yeah, no,
Maybe
I
he's
was
got a
going to bring
point.
this. I was going to bring this up because I'm reading at the moment Emmanuel Todd's Defeat of the West. He's a French historian, and he talks a lot about the death of the WASPs. So the WASP and the kind of WASP elites are basically not in charge anymore. We still I think we live in a society which mimics the WASP elites, but
Right, yeah.
but it's not the WASP elites anymore. It's all different people now. And that's not in defense or attacking them. It's just a historical observation. And he says this in his book. He says that the English boarding school thing was a mimicry of Spartan education, like a kind of watered down one. Not as tough, and probably more of an emphasis on the intellectual and less of an emphasis on the physical. But he says that the basic style of that kind of boarding school shit it's a kind of copy of the Spartan one. I was like, oh my God, you're right. That's kind of cool. That's pretty base, like we kind of make fun of the posh English kids in boarding school, but no, that's actually a pretty old school style of education. So you do see this whenever you see strong elites emerging historically. You do see certain pedagogical models, and they don't always look exactly how we think they look, and they don't always fit into these predictable kind of political categories of conservative or on the right, pro nuclear family. It's all a bit more complicated than that. I wanted to bring up one more example of this style of education. It's not from real life, but I think it's worth noting, and it's the Jedi. The Jedi, they're taken away from their parents at a very young age. They often don't even know their parents. It's brutal. And they are trained not intellectually, but they're trained spiritually, and they're trained obviously they're like warriors. They're like a kind of weird warrior elite, and they are taken away from their parents. And then you see within the Star Wars story the kind of problems of that, because Anakin is taken away from his mom, but he's taken away very late. He most would be taken away when they're 5 years old or something, but he's taken away when he's
and as a result, he's a petulant child.
He ends up marrying. He ends up going for an older woman. He's got a mommy issue thing. He goes against the Jedi Order because he's got a trauma. I hate the word, but whatever. A trauma of his mother being killed by the desert people, whoever the fuck they are, the sand people, and he fucking kills. You
can't use that word. You can't say that anymore, Owen. It's politically incorrect. You can't say that.
There's no political correctness on Schizo FM, and he does something which is reminiscent of the Republic. He has a personal attachment to his particular mother. I mean, totally justifiable. I mean, why wouldn't you? But this carries with him into adulthood, and he ends up carrying that trauma, and he destroys the Sand people. And no one gives a shit. He kills about 10, 15 Sand people. Whatever, right? But then to save Padme in this kind of Freudian tragedy way of what happened to my mother is inevitably going to happen to my girlfriend. He goes against the whole council, and he kills people, and he goes mental. So there is a sort of thing we can relate to Plato here, as if to say, if you have extremely disciplined, strong people that at the same time have a very particular interest, or maybe a kind of personal trauma or something like that, that can turn around and really be damaging towards the whole society. And maybe there's a lot of truth to that, perhaps.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's the same thing. You can be really strong, or you can be really intelligent, or you can be really charismatic, and that power can equally be used for virtuous things and for evil things, right? But I mean, say what you want about I mean, everyone knows the reputation the Greeks have, right? But you might call it the British boarding school based, but I would wager there's a lot more gay sex going on in a British boarding school.
Perhaps. Well, I went to an all boys Christian brother school. It wasn't a boarding school. It was just a Christian
But
brother
like
school.
Irish Catholic, right?
Yeah, and
Have a different flavor, right?
there's also a sense of that there. It's not the kind of elite boarding school stuff, but like it is very minimalistic. There is a kind of neutralization of everyone. Like everyone wears uniforms. It's only boys. Like if your dad's a fucking lawyer and your dad's and the other person's dad's unemployed, like no one really gives a shit. Like it's not your kind of personal kind of status in the family is sort of neutralized when you're in the school. I did get that impression a lot at the school I went to, and I do think that's deliberate and in my opinion probably good if you value like if you value merit, it actually is quite good. And also in Plato, there's a sense of minimalism. So the guardians, the people we're talking about here, are not allowed to own property. This is a big thing. This is a way in which they would distinguish themselves from the English boarding school people. They're not allowed to own property, and they live a very minimalistic life. And there's a lot of sacrifices involved in this pursuit of power. And I think that side could be related to more sort of Catholic asceticism and Catholic monasticism or something like that. I'm not sure, but yeah, no, like there's a lot of different comparisons we could make here. But that is something just for people listening to note also when we're thinking about this group of people, that yeah, like they have to live a very, very kind of I don't know what the word is, because it's not simple. And it's not totally impoverished, because they're not living like these in squalor. It's just they're not allowed to involve
Plato's guardians take wives, right?
Yeah. Okay, so that's something we can get into next, the whole marriage thing. But just to put a cap on the educational thing, they're not allowed to own property, and they don't live in squalor. It's not like a kind of performative impoverishment like you sometimes get with monks or people maybe in like Hindu religion, where they like live on the street and they put their arm in the air and they don't take their arm down for like 5 years. But it's not a performative impoverishment, so people don't need to freak out about it. But it's definitely a kind of it's a withdrawal from the concerns of money. Basically, I would say that.
Right.
Yeah. So yeah. Anyway, so do you want to get into the women, marriage, children kind of issue?
I do, and I'd say why that part I thought that was relevant to what's going on today is particularly, and the quote is, he aims to preserve the average of population. Like Plato's very much concerned about not overpopulating as well, which is interesting, and I thought that definitely brings up both the modern themes of population control, but also the more recent thing of birth rate as well.
Yeah, that's something I haven't thought about too much.
Yeah, that's just because it was in my mind when I read it. But yeah, explain what's Plato's views on the marriage, women, and weddings, and etc.
Okay, well, yeah, to get into the issue of marriage. So basically what happens in this model is a kind of collective rearing of the children. So first of all, this is where it gets quite unusual and probably off-putting to people, including myself. Like, I don't think I'd particularly like to live under this model. I'm not really too sure. It sounds a bit extreme. So we should probably put it this way. How do the guardians meet each other? Because there are female guardians and male guardians. Women are included into this class. Not all women, only the kind of chosen select women. So in that sense, again, like the Jedis, that like there's men and women, right? And unlike the Jedis, who aren't allowed to engage in any sort of, aren't supposed to, although they break the rules, but but the Plato's guardians are encouraged under certain circumstances to basically form relationships and reproduce. It's not totally well thought out though, because he doesn't want the fathers to be like explicitly known. Like if you're a female guardian and you have a baby and you've got a relationship with a male guardian, you're not really supposed to say, oh yeah, that's his dad. It's supposed to be sort of like the kid is raised commonly among the guardian class. Although in practical terms, it's going to be really obvious because everyone can see, Sally and fucking Michael hanging out with each other the whole time. So I don't know how he expects to keep that hidden, but this is not very well thought through, this part. But
there's like one ginger guardian and one ginger guardian child, and they're like, I wonder.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, he's got his hair. He's got his, big nose or something. It's gonna be
yeah, right.
like it's gonna be like no one knows, but everyone knows, kind of thing.
Right.
So I don't know how that part works. I think that's not very well thought out and probably quite stupid. But that's the idea that you don't know who your dad really is, and you sort of
right. And again, this is where Plato definitely doesn't see Freud coming, because that might cause more issues than not knowing who your parents are.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, I think the paternal identification problem is probably pretty bad here. Everyone's going to be confused, and like the whole legitimacy issue, because there's probably a reason why most of human history, like ideas of legitimacy were so kind of important to us. So this also quite overlooks that, and the idea that these kids will accept kind of a pure identification with Athens, or for example, or with the leader of Athens, rather than a particular identification with their own dad, is quite, that seems naive to me. I'm not sure things will, historically speaking, it seems to me that the particular identifications with your own are quite strong. So I don't really know how he's going to contain those psychological instincts. Yeah.
Right. So, but what are the, because I can't imagine the guardians being particularly romantic creatures. Like how are the two sides brought together?
Yeah, it's not very well explained. It's pretty much like there'll be some sort of festival. there'll be sort of meetings and festivals and parties and so on, by which the guardians can kind of freely interact with each other and basically screw each other, I think, is the kind of idea. And yeah, so that's basically it. Like a lot in Plato is like quite well thought out holistically, but the particularities are sometimes can be a bit silly. So this is definitely one of those moments. So yeah, you've basically got festivals, sex parties, yeah, basically something like that.
I'm just imagining like the hotel in the athletes' village at the Olympics Games. Pretty much is like what the guardians have to live in. Pretty much.
Yeah, you can imagine what kind of parties that would be, right?
Exactly, right.
These like hyper disciplined who finally get to party and like let off some steam after they've pulled off some miraculous military campaign, and they're all really like ready to go, and they're all like these strong, beautiful people, So it would be an interesting party to be at. I'd say that much. Right. I'm not really sure Plato's thought this part through properly. Yeah.
Right. I'm also just I'm curious. If you don't know, it's fine. I'm just curious because the whole eugenics question has been in my reading a lot recently, and I guess to bring the Star Wars analogy back, what is Plato's kind of like midichlorian? Like what is the makeup, like ethnically speaking, of a guardian? Like what is the genetic determination of like who makes a guardian, who isn't? Or is it just as vague as all the strongest and smartest? Like How does it
Yeah, I would say it's more just kind of based off of kind of observations of people as they're growing up and as they're developing. It's kind of on the level of observation. Like, I don't think Plato has a sort of idea of, like modern biological genetics. I think he's operating more on, well, okay, it's the Greeks, right? But I'm not sure that's like a dogma of Plato's. I think that might just be a kind of just a kind of social reality of the time he's in. Like, it's not like you could suddenly bring a load of people from, I don't know, like Germany or something, or Egypt, and just mingle them. Like back then, people really were more just in their kind of ethnic group. You are dealing with different city states as well, like within Greece, but they're all Greek, like, so they're all ethnically, from the same, the same circle, whatever. So, and like linguistically as well from the same, but like, yeah, it's kind of based off of observation of people's character. So like, you do get indications of this in the Republic. For example, I think one of the questions to Plato or to Socrates when he's describing the Republic is, like, so how do you determine, or no, like, how do you, first determine who gets to be in the Guardian class and who doesn't, and also how do you stop the people who are not in the Guardian class from getting jealous and envious of people in the Guardian class? And his answer seems to be basically kind of that you observe their development. So other guardians will sort of keep an eye out for children, and they will, I suppose, be looking for kind of signs of high level of, virtue, courage, wisdom, intelligence. I suppose there's sort of tests, there's aptitude tests of different sorts, physical and mental, that you could put the general Greek population through. I don't know. Like, there's different ways of finding out, but I do think it's more the pedagogical observation than it is anything biological. I think, it's because they didn't have an idea of modern genetics at that time, so it's kind of impossible for them to even think in that way.
I find it fascinating. I mean, just from my I've done some writing before on the word better in the English language, because I think it's just the worst and most philosophically perverse word. Because I don't know, like, as someone who's worked in tech before, you get tech people, programmers and stuff are like, oh, this database is just better. It's better. And it's like, well, you have to be substantive about that. What do you mean exactly? And when it comes to eugenics, this is really important, because, okay, like, we're going to make the human race, the human genetic stock better. Like, what do you mean by better? Like, are we going to just, look at, Germanic descent, maybe? I don't know. Are we going to do an IQ test? Are we going to maximize IQ as if, people with high IQ live really, really fulfilling lives or something like that, which they don't, by the way? Or are we going to maximize for low neuroticism and high conformity? Like, what is better? Like, it's a really interesting question. And that applies to both positive and negative eugenics. Like, what do we want to, I think the words that he used, he says, breeding among the best should be often, and breeding among the inferior should be seldom. So, like, what is often and what is seldom? Like, what do we encourage? What do we not encourage? I think it's a really interesting question.
Yeah, totally. And I think Plato's good on this, because I do think he has a healthy dose of skepticism, I think, towards very simplistic or reductive answers to this question. In other dialogues, you do see skepticism towards a kind of Greek chauvinism that says, we're Greek, therefore we're better than the whatever Egyptians or the Macedonian, whoever. Clearly at the time, the Greeks had an exceptionality, a kind of cultural exceptionality to most other peoples. But I think Plato's concerned with thinking about the sort of basic reasoning and causation behind that exceptionality, and sort of drawing kind of universal principles from it. I'm not saying that like these are universal principles in this like cheap, modern, humanistic sense of like, we just need, more investment and more education and we can all be amazing. It's not that simple. Like but understanding, and like this is why pedagogy is principles of virtue and instill that in the educational system, and you can, maybe this is a kind of optimistic point, reproduce a sort of excellence, or reproduce a sort of fundamental sense of like eliteness in the classical sense, or like royalty in the classical sense. So yeah, there's a sense of better. I think Plato's, he's trying to understand what better is, through education and through this kind of paradoxical fusion of these different opposing parts of cooperation and aggressivity, warlikeness, and so on, intelligence, physical. So it's like, I would say Plato would say that you can't answer the question simply. Like if we try to answer the question, what is better, we're going to get into the perplexity of a Socratic dialogue. We're going to go, okay, well, we need to find out what justice is. But once we get to like a definitional point, we don't know what it is. We can't define it, but it's there. And like, it's this space, I think, which Plato was always operating in. And I think the failure of like, American exceptionalism, or like Nazi race, like Nazi kind of master race ideas, or like kind of just managerial meritocracy or anything like that, is basically that it doesn't really philosophically engage too much with that question you asked. It's like, well, what do you mean by better? So I would say in some sense Plato thinks if you want to truly be better, you have to engage with what do you mean by better. You have to go through a philosophical route. And this is reinforced by one of his dialogues, Alcibiades, which says, Socrates says to Alcibiades, if you want to improve a shoe, you have to know what a shoe is. So it's like, if you want to improve a human, you have to know what a human is, which means that you have to ask the questions of like, well, what is a human? What is human nature? What is the end of human pursuits and all that? You have to go through the philosophical angle. So if you fail to go through the philosophical angle, you're not going to improve anything, because you don't know what it is you're doing. You're just going to be like making things bigger, smaller. It's going to be relativism. It's going to be relative, bigger, smaller, richer, poorer, blah, 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 blah.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
And I actually think that's a really interesting point, and something that we are missing in anything pretty much past antiquity into like more modern philosophy, is that these frameworks often become very myopic. Either, they're looking at, we want big, strong, like people with Nordic features or something like that. And you're maximizing for that one thing, right? Or you're maximizing based on IQ and whatever. And you become very myopic based on that one thing. But it doesn't really capture the kind of holistic point, because obviously like IQ has something to do with it. Your ethnic background has something to do with it. But they're going back to the example of the boarding school, like not everyone who went to a boarding school was like hugely successful. Not everyone who was a citizen of, England and the British Empire was like, very useful to the empire. But there was something about that setup that produced just enough of the leaders and the soldiers to conquer the world, basically, if that's what you wanted to produce, right? There's something more holistic there than just looking at, okay, we need to make big, strong British dudes. Like, it doesn't really, there's something about the nurture as well as the nature, and also the social connections and systems, both the boarding school system, the political system, and like the military system and the merchant system, everything together. There's something about that setup that worked in that feedback loop at that time.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And if you wanted to be a sort of somewhat optimistic rationalist, not in the modern sense, but just even in the classical sense, you could say that once you understand this paradigm, you can sort of you have some control over reproducing an elite and of a culture which is truly excellent. I mean, like, that is a hugely optimistic assertion, but And there's so many conservative, I can hear like Peter Hitchens or someone in the back of my mind going, but wait a minute, it's not that easy, blah, blah, blah. Like, man is born in sin and everything we do is futile, blah, blah, blah. And, but like, I don't know, like, I think I am a little bit optimistic there, that I think that once you understand this paradigm, that there is more wiggle room, culture, and a better elite. But you have to look at things holistically. You have to get out of this. You have to look at things holistically and not reductively. And also you have to get out of this cheap, easy response to say, oh yeah, it's just because we're, this race, which is why we're better. It's just because, we have this much money. This is why we're better. It's just because, you have to stop looking for these easy answers to these questions as well, which is really hard for people to stop doing.
Our birth rate is too low, therefore that's why things are going bad. Like it's really stupid. And this is getting away from Plato a little bit and onto my own work, but I definitely come at this whole topic from a perspective of eugenical realism. That we don't have to talk about eugenics, we can talk about what Plato's talking about here. But we're stuck in this system anyway. These things are happening anyway. Our elites are being selected. There is technology that is basically grouping people up and either firing them off into producing loads and loads of offspring, or firing them off and making them completely like unreproductive. This system is happening anyway, and we have no choice but to engage with it, despite what moralists like Peter Hitchens might say.
Yeah, true.
We don't have a choice. We're in this system anyway, and like, do we want to change it for the better, or do we want to continue right now where we already have the wedding festival playing out in dating apps all the time?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, like it's the question of improvement. Like it's like, we are already being improved, like in a way in which we don't have a kind of individualistic liberal way to just bow out of. I would think like whenever we engage with society, we're kind of unfortunately, sort of pushed into mechanisms of like what the society believes is better, and it's really difficult to like insulate yourself from that. And so it's like, you may as well just kind of like jump on that energy and like try and maneuver it towards something that's genuinely good, rather than stepping back and saying, there's no way to improve anything. Everything is futile. This kind of very pessimistic, kind of conservative attitude is I don't know. I think that itself is kind of futile, I think. But on the question of like race and like that kind of thing, I'm not entirely sure what Plato kind of thinks about this, whether he thinks that there's like is there racial predispositions to our behavior, for example, right? To a culture behavior, like is there a racial predisposition of the Germans? Is there a racial predisposition of the Chinese or whatever? Like, because
honestly, that's so, thinking about it even remotely in the current framework is so removed from the world that Plato's in. Like there's no, Plato's not, he's not talking about the difference between a Chinese person and a German person. Like this is all within the context of his society. Like it's not even, I think that's a misstep in trying to understand what he's writing about. I think.
But like, because I just know, because I know there's increasing popularity along the, in the right wing, understandably sometimes, perhaps sometimes not, but like to kind of react against these liberal universal ideas, which is basically summarized by something like Martin Luther King, I want to be judged by the content of my character rather than the color of my skin, sort of thing. There's this question of like, okay, well, if you have this kind of paradigm for reproducing a good society and a good set of elites, can you is that abstracted from concerns of like genetic influence and race and so on and so forth? And I would say that like my answer to this, I kind of thought this through, and I was like, there probably is some racial genetic predetermination in peoples, right? But that doesn't mean necessarily that like it makes one group of people non-applicable to this paradigm and it makes another group of people more applicable. So that there is something, I think it was Aristotle who said it, and it was quite Greek, you know, it was in favor of the Greeks, but like he said the northern, I think it was, could have been Plato, could have been Aristotle, but it was one of them. He said that like the northern Europeans, the Celts and the Germanics basically, are very high spirited and courageous and warlike, but they kind of lack they sometimes lack rationality. And the kind of Asian states below them are intelligent, like they're good with trade, they're good with math and so on, but they lack that warlike spirit. And the Greeks were a perfect fusion of the two, right? So it's very sympathetic for the Greeks. But I think that doesn't mean like that doesn't mean that like the Greeks are genetically predisposed to be great and everyone else is predisposed to be imbalanced. I just think it means it just means something like this. If you're the northern warlike states, you have to realize, I mean, this was back then, it's different today, but back then you have to realize that you may have a kind of genetic predisposition for whatever reasons, climate, just a history of eugenic selection, which goes back fucking thousands of years. You may have a predisposition towards war and kind of manly courage, and like that's good, but you just have to temper that with the opposite in order to kind of stabilize yourselves. Same thing goes for the kind of unwarlike Asians. It's like your intelligence is good, but you just have to kind of be aware of the paradigm here and stabilize yourselves and not go completely one-sided. So like there is room here to accept racial distinctions and at the same time not exclude one group from this paradigm, if that makes sense.
You've totally hit on it there, and it comes back to my issue with the word better. Or you could say, you know, Aristotle said great, right? That's his word. It's a synonym, right? And all I'm saying is like, it's strange because there is a time when it's actually better to be warlike. There is a time where it's better to be more warlike. And there is a time when it's better to be mercantile. And there's a time when it's better to be in the middle. Like it really is contextual. It depends.
Totally, yeah. And I would say our time is probably more in the middle, which is why I think that these ideas are coming back to light. Maybe it's just us because it's Schizo FM and we do the real shit. But I do think in general, there's more thought about this stuff than there was like 20, 30 years ago. Because like, for example, if you live in Dark Age Europe, you basically need to be warlike. I mean, that's just it. Like you can't, like, you know, being intelligent and rational is good, but you basically need to be warlike, and that's
warlike with a sprinkling of theological freaks.
Oh yeah, of course. Like it's never just one thing. But like,
kind of, in a way, they're kind of the guardians. They're very ascetic, but they're definitely kind of the guardians in a way.
Yeah. But like and like post-war period, and this is the problem with the boomers and the kind of boomer regime is that like the world was exhausted from war. You had global trade. You in the West didn't have any big threats. Nuclear weapons nullified all this kind of issues. Blah 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 blah. Technology progress, capitalism, and you didn't need warlike people. So there's a sort of a character instillment of like, well, this is the good people. We're like this. We're sort of managerial and rational and tolerant. And then all of a sudden, Russia's invaded Ukraine. You know, the sort of financial system breaks down. There's a huge excess
it's even more granular than that, because if you're in like, you know, the managerial West, if you're warlike in any way, you're in prison. Exactly. It's very granular and contextual. Like you can't be warlike in the office.
You can be warlike with your spreadsheets.
You can be a girl boss, I suppose, or something like that.
You can be, yeah, exactly.
I don't know if you can bring a spear and impale your enemies in HR these days. Not yet.
Yeah, exactly.
Just a few years.
Even that sort of workplace sort of competitiveness is proof of this idea, because you have like these kind of competitive and like kind of ruthless people, but like they're acting it out in a setting which really isn't competitive or ruthless in any meaningful sense, you know? So you kind of have these sort of psychological return of the repressed moments where like, Have you seen American Psycho? Do you know when they're like arguing over their business cards and they're like, "Oh my
Yes.
god, his business card is so amazing. It's got laminate silver, blah blah blah." It's that kind of shit. It's like these men probably belong on a battleship, but they're stuck in an office, so they're sort of releasing those instincts in like these really comical ways. Actually, in that film, they're releasing those instincts through actual murder as well. So there's that. But yeah. Anyway, like this whole shit just is really.
Patrick Bateman is definitely, he's kind of like us, right? So you've got the Northern Hordes who have all their stat points in warlike, right? You have the Asiatic people who have all their stat points in maths, intelligence, and like trade. And then you've got the schizo people, which is like, I guess, us and Patrick Bateman, who have all of our points in schizo, which is kind of like the luck equivalent on the stats, right?
Schizo FM is the new Guardian class, yeah.
I hope not. God help the world if that comes true.
Yeah, but do you want to touch on probably the last area I can think of, which is like we haven't really touched on at all, is the role of women within the Guardian class, because this is one of the more controversial points, because Plato, it's something we can get into, but Plato doesn't really bring up women like almost ever in any of his dialogues, but then suddenly they're involved in the Guardian class. And I think that's kind of confusing. It was confusing to me when I first read it. And it's a contemporary issue of like the role of women within society, and like, the mixed gendered workplaces and in universities and all that shit. So perhaps if you want, we could get into that for a few minutes.
Mm-hmm. Okay, explain to me what does Plato think the role of women is then? Or
in the Guardian class they're involved, right? Like they are part of the Guardian class. Now there's a question of like this: was Plato therefore like a feminist or something, or did he think genders are equal? And I see this is the section which I wish I had the book next to me so I could quote it directly. But if you read it carefully, yes, the women are involved, but there's an underscore where Socrates basically says, the higher sense of responsibility will naturally go to the men. So the women are involved, but there's a kind of caveat from the very beginning, if you get me, where it's like they're involved, but we all know basically that at the end, right, at the end of the day, the men are going to be taking the higher roles and responsibility.
This might not be the exact point the part you're talking about, but the quote I wrote down. So of men, he describes them as the guardians and watchdogs of the herd. And for women, he says they perform wholly or partially the actions of men. So he's kind of like saying, he's saying what I guess a lot of maybe anti-feminist people say. He's just like, some females are capable of doing everything a man could do, but most partially maybe sometimes.
Yeah. So exactly.
He's very polite about it.
He is quite polite about it, and like there is like there's discussion of interesting discussion in that dialogue, in that passage, of like an observation that some women can do the things that some men can do, but generally that's not true. And and like that's I
just love it. He understands per capita. I love it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, like, but
he passed the IQ test.
But like it shows you the complications of this, because I do think if you were speaking purely of like a physical war kind of warrior class, it's so rare that you're going to get like a Brienne, from Game of Thrones, kind of. Right. I don't know if you watch Game of Thrones, but like a kind of beastly woman who's stronger than your average man. But like
I mean that's every action film with a female protagonist, right? Where
exactly. Yeah.
Somehow like doing backflips over men and breaking their wrists and all this sort of stuff. And I don't know, man. This is maybe a little bit mean, but like if you've ever seen a woman in a fight before, it doesn't usually go that way. I know there are some tough chicks out there, but it doesn't normally go that way.
No, it doesn't. And like, and I like and this is the complication. Like the physical distinction between men and women is huge. There's some species of animals where this physical distinction between the males and the females is quite minimal. Human beings are biologically, for some weird reason, extremely distinct physically. At least adults are. And it's not just size and weight. I mean, like the bone density of men. Like we know this from modern biology. Like,
my favorite fact about this, very interesting. Those people talk about the chromosomes and bone density and stuff. My favorite one is, and this explains why men open jars. Okay, you would think it's because we're stronger, right? On average, right? You would think it's part of it, but the main reason is the collagen on men's hands is in a crisscross pattern. So it creates more friction, and the collagen on women's hands is in a straight pattern. So it's less friction, and that's also why they tend to have smoother skin. Fact.
Oh, wow. Okay. Interesting.
Crazy, right?
So like he got all these little intrinsic things. Actually, another anecdotal example is when I once had to have surgery for some cartilage that was torn, and the doctor kind of said to me, he said, you could be okay without the surgery. You could be okay, but you would do better with it, but you could be okay without it. He said, if you were a woman, I tell you to get it. And I was like, why? And he was like, because literally the toughness of your cartilage on men and women is just, it's not even equivalent. Like the like if you have torn cartilage as a man, you can basically expect to just have the same level of torn cartilage. Potentially, it depends entirely on many different circumstances, the individual health of the person. If you exercise a lot, maybe you're exercising too much in a certain way, which is tearing it, or injuries, so many different. But in general, you can have like torn cartilage as a man, and it will basically kind of stabilize in that position, right? So let's say your neck is as torn cartilage, it's kind of stabilized. But in women, it's more common for the injury to kind of degenerate over time. Right.
Wow.
So it's like get worse and worse. And this is what he told me anyway. And I was like, oh wow, that's very interesting. So like it's like there's all these interesting kind of physiological differences between men and women that like modern medicine and science can kind of point us to, even though at the same time, like we live in the world where we have like transgender men fighting women in boxing rings. I'd like, that's not even something that we should even get into, but like, but the point I'm trying to make is that like when you have a ruling class, which is determined purely by physical attributes, it's kind of obvious, right? It's very rare distinctions where one is as good as the other. But when you have a ruling class, which becomes more mental, more intellectual, then the distinctions start to blur. You know what I mean? Then you have much more overlap,
Yeah, I agree. I totally agree. And I think I don't know. I think, Plato is pretty woke in a sense that not in like the way we would say woke as an insult, but woke as in actually quite realistic on this is like, there is a lot that those exceptional women, if it's physically, have to offer society, right? And there's a lot that those exceptional women who don't fall in the normal range of intelligence, which is generally higher than men, but men have the long tails, right, on their IQ at least. There's something to be offered there, and he's leaving the door open for that. He's like, yeah, sure, like if you can completely or partially fulfill the role of men, come and join us and have a go, right? But I think it'd be wrong to say, and I think this is where probably, I don't know because I'm not well read on it like you are, but I would guess that the scholarship on this, where people are trying to read into him as some sort of proto-feminist or communist or something like this, is very selective in what it reads and is, putting ideas into his head in the same way that people, try and read Nietzsche as some sort of communist or feminist, because there's a million different interpretations of him, basically. And actually, he's actually, I think it would say probably he's egalitarian in the sense that like, if it's possible and there's something to offer, then go for it. But I would say he's probably more realistic and woke in the fact that he acknowledges there are these like intrinsic differences in the way we're made up, and also the things that make a woman's life fulfilling are on the whole very different from what makes a man's life fulfilling. The whole question of fulfillment that's another factor that we haven't even that's maybe me coming from a modern perspective and thinking like, people have to be fulfilled or whatever. I'm sure Plato doesn't really give a shit about whether people feel fulfilled or whatever. But.
Yeah, I think Plato's a hard ass. He doesn't give a shit. I think actually Aristotle cares more about that, which is why Aristotle has a more nuanced opinion on. I'm much less well read on Aristotle than Plato, but Aristotle does have a critique of Plato's kind of communitarian idea of raising children.
He's much less. I would say he's much less much less harshly like political. I would say.
Yeah, he's
on the individual and existential level, to use another anachronistic term, but he does think about it that way a bit more, from what I've read.
Yeah, no, 100%. Yeah, he does. So, like, you immediately see, even within ancient Greece, within like a generation, people pushing back against some of this stuff. But like, it's basically, for me, the important thing is like the question. I mean, okay, I do think that there's a secondary question here of like how our embodiment, and this is a very modern question, like how our gendered embodiment and how our physical embodiment affects our emotional and intellectual frame, So it's not really like, you have to have a very kind of rational cogito idea to think, okay, physically men and women are very distinct, but mentally they're very similar. I actually do think that there's a lot of room to argue that actually, no, like mentally and physically, men and women are actually very distinct mentally as well as physically. And but the problem is that like if you have a kind of ruling class which establishes itself based on rationality and rational intelligence, you're definitely going to have a more like gender fluid ruling class, because even though there's emotional distinctions and there's distinctions in which in a sense of like what fulfills you on some fundamental kind of spiritual level or something, you're gonna have observably, if you take like exam results or something or IQ tests into account, you're gonna have a lot of women that are doing better than a lot of men, right? If you have a purely mental view of your hierarchy. Now I know it's tail ended, like the elites, the absolute best people will probably still be men, but that whole middle ground will be brought into the society. So I think there's also this problem of like okay, so Plato's like a philosopher and he's valuing the rational and he's valuing the mental, and he's probably living in a time which is extremely warlike and physical, and he's kind of going, let's make our elites in some sense more philosophical or more rational. But then as soon as he does that, he encounters the question of gender. Well, it's like, well, if you do that, well, then look at these women who are clearly kind of intelligent. So why don't you let them involve themselves in the ruling class? And then it's like,
actually,
shit, no, we've opened up Pandora's box now. What are we going to do?
Exactly. And I would argue that's actually where one of the problems of what we're talking about starts, is with Plato and the philosophers of antiquity, because that's where you start to see the mind-body separation start to happen. And that has its effects in, like views on the spirit and stuff like that. And that goes all the way through into Christianity, all the way through Western philosophy. This comes through, right? And it is a huge problem, because as soon as you get to viewing things that way from that context, then okay, all of a sudden, you start doing stuff in science and you start slicing open brains and you're like, oh, look at men and women's brains, they're made of the same stuff, right? Men and women have the same brains. What are we talking about? They're the same, right? But then you don't realize, you're not looking at things from a holistic viewpoint, and then you realize that, at least normatively speaking, like women's bodies are estrogen baths and men's bodies are testosterone baths, and that has a huge impact on the way you think. Like, we say brain as if brain is separate and thinking as if it's separate from the body, and that's a very Western idea. It's just not true. It's not true materially.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, it's not. And like, I do think in Plato, like exactly like as you're saying, you do see the beginnings of that split. But I think some of the reasons these dialogues are interesting is because I do think that you also see that split, Plato trying to kind of ground that split. He doesn't want it to like completely take off into craziness, which is why he's coming up with paradigms of like courage and embodiment mixed with rationality and cooperation and so on. So but like I do think that you're basically right in terms of like philosophy and gender roles, that like as soon as you have that split happen, you have ideas about gender equality. Like as soon as that happens, Like, and it makes perfect sense in the West because, you know, like Europe is paradoxical because in some sense, like historically, it's like the most manly and warlike place ever. Like the Vikings, the Celts, the Germanics, like it's just like, but at the same time, it came up with this split. So which, and like that's why I think you have these paradoxes of places like Scandinavia, where you have these histories of like extremely warlike masculine men, but they're like ultra feminist nowadays, you know. And you're like, how did that happen? Well, maybe because they have like the history of Northern Europeans, but at the same time they've inherited this sort of like this kind of cogito split. So, you know, if that, I'm not sure if that makes sense, but
the best, specifically talking about the Scandinavians, the best theory I've heard on this is actually that, okay, yeah, they were like incredibly warlike, strong, these sorts of things, like favored, you know, they had Viking culture, right? They had a Viking culture.
Yeah.
But basically the people who were settled on the land didn't like the more like aggressive and warlike and basically their leaders. So like a lot of them obviously left as Vikings, right? But then, you know, when things got much later on and, you know, it was becoming in Europe better to be a mercantile and a cooperative nation as opposed to one that conquers other places, like the genetic, like what was selected for was the more intellectual version of Scandinavians as opposed to like the more bull-like version.
Oh, okay.
And actually a lot of the genetic material that was that thing was they were just sent away. They were sent away or they went away by their own accord to different places.
So like, yeah, like that genetic
it's a theory,
material.
but it's an interesting one that I've heard.
No, that's actually very interesting. Like that genetic material ended up becoming the French, like the Normans, and
mixed with the French, mixed with the British, you know, which then again it's like okay, I would say Anglos are definitely primarily a mercantile race, but let's not pretend we don't conquer things.
No, but that like the Anglos are a good example of that because I do think they are primarily, but they have this element of adventure and conquer in them as well.
Yeah.
Actually, also a lot of Vikings went to Ireland as well. Like the place I'm from, Waterford, is a Viking settlement and a Norman settlement. Like it was conquered by Vikings and then Normans. So you have this complete like Nordic history, and you do get still within the Irish a sensibility of like, you know, the Conor McGregors of the world and shit like that. So it's like, but at the same time, we never conquered anywhere. So it's like, you know, you've all these paradoxes, but that actually makes sense about the Scandinavians because they had a kind of ocean access from where they were living. So for example, the Germans never had that as much of an ocean access. So I think in some sense they retained their warlikeness for longer. But if you're saying the Scandinavians, because they're very similar, like genetically probably, right? So like then you have them, I suppose, like outsourcing that aggressiveness and then it breeding into other populations. Yeah, that actually fits Oswald Spengler's. I think I'm not very well read on him, but I'm pretty sure he has this idea of like the Faustian spirit coming from the north. So that theory is probably has some truth to it. And it does fit basically the whole thing we're talking about here of like you have these different dispositions. You have the feminine, the masculine, the warlike, the unwarlike, and Plato wants to fuse them together. And he's using ideas of eugenics to fuse them together, and also of pedagogy, which for him are quite much more interrelated than in modern times. I think you've got more of like a eugenics being all like biological and scientific, and then pedagogy being like all moral and intellectual. But yeah, like the way those demographics are dealt with, like do they fuse together? Do you have a kind of war class and a kind of peasant class? Does that part of the population just go conquer somewhere else and breed into others? So on and so on and so on. It's interesting. It's an interesting way to look at the kind of like historical changes in demographics and stuff like that too.
Do you want to see some clips?
Yeah. Go on, show me some clips. Yeah.
I've got some related clips. Let me find what I'm looking for. Okay. See if you can guess what's going on in this one. So what do you think's happening there?
Well, I mean, there's a bunch of kids smoking cigarettes.
So this is, I guess this is how Portugal is training their guardians, I suppose. This is a town in
It's Portugal, is
Portugal.
it? Okay.
Yeah, which is strange because I thought a little bit Eastern European looking, maybe, but it was Portugal. And it's a place, I'm going to butcher the pronunciation, but it's Vale de Sanguero. And basically they have a festival in this one village every year or every few years, and for some reason one of the aspects of the festival is children smoke at the festival, and it's celebrated that. I did not find an explanation for it, but this is you go on the Wikipedia page for this town, it just says, yep, they have a festival once a year and children smoke at the festival.
And what was your idea of like, how does this fit into the whole family part? Is it just because it's like kids?
It's kids smacking. I don't know. I wonder if Plato would approve or not.
I'm not sure he would approve. I don't know. He doesn't. I didn't read the section on smoking, but no, I don't know. I have a feeling that he would think that's not the community looking after their kids properly. But then again, there's a whole question of like, if you don't have their parents looking after them, will they just go off and do wild shit like that?
Yeah, I don't know. It could be what's the book where all the children are on the island? Lord of the Flies.
Lord of the Flies. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Here's my last clip. Where is it? Oh no, wait! I've got two more clips.
Yeah, cool.
This one's interesting. Are those the women guardians we're talking about?
No, I think Plato would have them in the gulag pretty soon. I don't think they'd last very long. In guardian school, behaving in such an undisciplined way.
The comment, the writing on that like report very funny, because it's like, oh, women are discouraged from expressing these emotions. Like, what are you talking about? In modern society, you think people aren't discouraged from being absolutely bloody insane all the time? Like,
well, it's funny that they claim that.
I would say.
Yeah, well, it's funny that they claim that while they film it and advertise it.
It's on it's on like a big news network. Like, what are you talking about? Like praised.
Like it's like, yeah, sure. If you act that way in the supermarket, people are gonna fucking judge you. But like, you're not being like, beaten over the back of the head for behaving like that, like in certain settings. And even if you behave that way in the supermarket today, you're not going to get like jail. You might get like thrown out of the supermarket, but you're not going to get like.
Yeah, that's just, if you do that in a supermarket, you're an oil protester, right?
Well, yeah, exactly. There's all these interesting ways in which that's coming out, but yeah, like that's an interesting aspect to like female psychology that maybe poses somewhat of a problem for Plato's having a male and female guardian class, perhaps. I'm not sure. It's just like, how is because he's kind of assuming that men and women express that warlike aggressive tendencies in the same way, and I think it's quite clear they don't generally.
No,
like
definitely
this
not.
Like, I know we were complaining about Jordan Peterson privately yesterday, but like because of his weird sort of performative like endorsement of the X team, or the
X team,
the X team, X-Men. But like he's a good example of someone who's correct about something, that like men and women express that aggression in different ways. kind of social sabotage and kind of lying and that kind of stuff is more.
Oh yeah, that could be any number of things. It could be the fact that your body's just flowing with estrogen. Like if you ever met a man who's quite high and obviously quite high in estrogen, they manifest themselves in similar ways. I would argue.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. And like I think like I don't know, like this stuff about women expressing their anger in this very sort of like, kind of animalistic way. I do think it's a fake. I think it's a fake because if you look at actual society, like the way women's aggressivity is actually on a day-to-day basis expressed is through those sort of passive aggressive sort of mechanisms we were just discussing. Like
it's crazy. Like I mean, it takes a bit of research to understand the ins and outs of the what's going on in the Middle East politically, right? But I've had female friends try and describe, what's going like the office politics for them right now, and I can't make heads or tails of it. It's too complex.
Okay, yeah.
Oh, yeah, something makes sense, but like it's too complex. It's different skills, right? Like they're able to store all this passive aggressive information. I don't have the capacity for it.
Yeah, like they remember stuff to bring it up like at a much later day. Yeah, like how did you even remember that? Like it's like
exactly. To make notes on everything I read or else I forget it. I would love that kind of memory.
But like it's only when it comes to that kind of aggressive emotion that memory is like stored. But like this is kind of the stuff like Bill Burr, for example, talks about in like the difference between men and women, like how they argue and stuff. But anyway, like the point is that clearly there's complicated factors which influence how men and women express aggression differently. And we definitely have a society, and this is one of the shit things about our society, like the genuinely shit things that if I had like if I was the imperial overlord of the new Schizo FM empire, I would immediately somehow like regulate all the female aggressive tendencies, because we live in a society of like it's like office politics or like social sabotage, and it's like it's such a miserable environment to be constantly exposed to this shit, because it is aggression, and like you are exposed to constant aggression, and it's like it's not transparent, and you never see it coming, and it's always in the background, and I think it causes so much mental health problems, why we have so physically much anxiety, right? Exactly, yeah. People get anxiety about like implicit rules and like how you should behave and who's talking about who and all this stuff. It's natural, but like it's just
and in my experience, actually, when I have had anxiety, that's less from that sort of stuff and more from actual like physical danger. I would prefer the fight or flight I feel from physical danger than the constant like social bullshit.
I think most men do, like, and even a lot of women as well. I think even a lot of women, like, it's just that we're brainwashed into thinking that physical danger is like the worst thing in the world.
Yeah.
It's like, no, not necessarily.
Okay, this is my last clip. Can I find it? Okay, this one's funny. I like this one.
Locked himself in his house for 55 years so that he would not have any contact with women. I kid you not, this man decided to stay inside his house when he was 16 years old. He did this because he wanted to avoid talking or being around women. Now he is 71 years old. This means he has been inside his house for 55 years without going out. It's hard to understand why this man made such a big decision that affected him so much. He lives in a very unique way that is different from most people. Finding him was tough because he stays from the others, especially women.
Pause for a sec.
Sorry.
It's funny. It's just funny how he's like building a fence to keep the women out.
He's got a compound. He's got a gated community.
I wonder what would be a more effective way to keep women out. Like you could put like I don't know. I'm failing to think of a really funny sexist joke right now, but like, there's got to be some interesting ways to build an anti-women compound. I'll think it through and I'll say it next time.
The audience can insert their own sexist joke there.
Put your sexist jokes in the comments.
We've all got them. Yeah, put your own in the comments.
Meet Calixte, a man who made a big decision. He decided to stay in his small house and hardly ever go outside. He did this because he believed strongly that he should not talk to women. Now, at 71 years old, his story is about being alone, giving up things, and changing in a way he didn't expect. My name is Calixte Zamuta. The reason I locked myself inside and have a fence on my house is because I want to make sure that women will not come closer to me. I don't want women around me because they make me really scared.
It's the only logical decision. So based.
I think a lot of modern men can relate to that. But like,
well, no, I mean, it seems weird because he's like a bushman and living in a hut in Africa somewhere, probably. But it's not much different from an incel shutting themselves in their own room.
Well, that's what's surprising about it. Like, if it's a modern country, a developed country, like I kind of understand. But like a African guy in the bush, it's hard to imagine he's experiencing the same sorts of like social issues we were talking about, like in the office or whatever. You know,
no, he just really doesn't like women.
He could just be genuinely scared of women.
Yeah, I get the impression it's less of a hatred and more of a fear or a spiritual reason or something like that. I don't know though. I would love to speak.
Perhaps it could be. He would be a good schizo guest to have a conversation.
I think we might need a translator, and also I guess we'd have to send like I don't know, like a laptop and a webcam and whatever SpaceX Wi-Fi thing, the dish thing to him to get him to be able to speak to us.
Yeah, he'd probably have to like have a tech update. His little anti-women stronghold would have to be a bit upgraded. You know, he could perhaps have like lasers or like CCTV cameras that could like scan for any signs of women coming to us.
We'd have to assure him that we don't ever have women guests on the show.
Well, we have had a woman guest, Sam. We have. yeah, but it's an interesting topic, the whole like female, aggressiveness and how that plays out socially. Because I do think that's really, like, in my opinion, that's really the thing making people fucking miserable today. And it's not anti-women to say that, because like it's happened because we've stopped regulating those sorts of behaviors, because like the whole economy is shifted largely towards kind of work. But it fits into the whole thing we were talking about of like a society that has become in some sense too rational or too mental or too managerial or too mercantile or something like this. Generally tends to shift towards more female included spaces. And like, it's not just the kind of woke liberal West or whatever, which I think is increasingly not going to be woke and liberal in the next 10 years. But that's a different conversation. But even like Japan, for example, right? Like you see these young guys who just won't leave. They're kind of like modern. They're like Japanese versions of this dude. And like
Hikikomori, I think is the word in Japanese.
Yeah, and like they just don't. And it's always the same thing. It's particularly young men, because you got a higher testosterone level and you got like more hormones running through you, and you got like. You know what I mean? You're just like not as well socially adapted, for better or for worse. And like, you know what I mean? And you just have this kind of landmine of like insane shit to do with like kind of, which are all based, in my opinion, largely around kind of female aggressivity. And you kind of got a digital office economy or whatever. And it's the same thing everywhere. Like you're going to see the same thing in Japan. You're going to see the same thing in fucking Sweden. You're going to see the same thing in America, Canada, wherever you are. Like it's going to be the same issue. And like a good way to look at that is through like how female aggression has sort of like altered the social landscape, which kind of fits our thing. And that perhaps that's something Plato didn't take into account as well, if we're going to critique him a little bit as well. Like the guardian class, how would the guardian class be altered by this inclusion of women into it? You know, like, you know, you could have a Me Too movement or something in the guardian class. It's all interesting. It's all interesting stuff. But like, I do sort of wonder in some sense why, like, you have a birth gap crisis in like these kind of Western countries, like, and you got similar issues happening in both. So I do wonder if basically, and it's not even just about the inclusion of women, like as we were saying earlier, it's like the inclusion of women seen in light of a social hierarchy which is based increasingly on like mental and managerial and rational virtues rather than physical warlike virtues. I think that's like the good way of looking at it.